Hey AP. In this video we're going to go over your last object-oriented programming assessment. The purpose of this assessment is to give you plenty of time working on an existing class hierarchy and responding to why it gives you particular output. Typically, last year my experience with this assessment was that it was a really good exercise in getting a final and complete understanding for how classes work, how their instances can interact with each other, so on and so forth. So the purpose of this assessment is for you to take as much time as you need to answer the questions completely. It is not a timed assessment, okay? It's not about getting it right the first time, it's about getting it right over time and improving your answer as you realize you're getting things wrong or you're misunderstanding something, okay? So I'm actually going to give you the solutions. I'm not going to give you the explanations, that's up to you, but I'm going to give you all the output solutions. I'm going to show you how to work through this. I'm going to give you an example of how I would respond to the first output with a proper explanation, okay? And that way you can achieve, the best possible grade, which maybe is your concern, but really what I want you to achieve is the best possible understanding of this stuff before we move on to our next subject, which is algorithm analysis. Okay, so let's get started looking at this assessment. There are really two places that you're going to be looking as you work through this assessment. The first is here on the right. This is the assessment itself. For each of these questions, we're going to go over what these mean in just a second, but notice that there's two parts basically to each question. The first is what is the output of running that code in the shell, and then an explanation of why that happens. So what is it that causes this particular line of code to output whatever is in output here? And you need to be thorough, you need to be accurate, and you need to be precise in your explanation. One thing I want to point out are these two output questions right here. These are on, this has two lines of output, both of these do. So John.work, slice of 10, proletariat.work John, that also has two lines of output. So just make sure you press the enter key between those two lines of output. Let's take a look at the document that you're going to be referencing. And in addition to this document, I would encourage you to go ahead and take this code. You probably won't be able to copy paste it. In fact, I'll test it in a second. You should just type it into Replit. That way you have an interactive environment to work with. Okay? But the way this works is that on the left, right, you're going to be seeing expressions. And on the right, it says interactive output. So what we are doing is we're going to be given an expression like worker.work or 1 divided by 0, and Python will give us some output if we type these expressions into the shell or the interpreter, right? So what you're doing is predicting what the interactive output would be when we type in each expression. Okay, so your goal is to write down what would the output be if I type this expression into the shell. And I'm going to work through this first one for you so you completely understand what's going on. One more thing I want to point out is notice that we have a slightly different format here in our, I'll zoom in a little. We have a slightly different format here in our class, and I want to explain how this works. So notice for Classworker, there is just a plain variable that says greeting is sir. And then for class bourgeoisie, we have sort of the same thing where greeting is peon. The way this works is that every instance of Classworker has a greeting which is sir, and every instance of class bourgeoisie has a greeting which is peon. You can think of this as something that is tied to self.greeting. It's kind of like that. It's just that this is something that's associated with every single instance by default. It's kind of like when we would type in a default value for greeting here. It's just done in a slightly different way. So you'll see an example of that when we do the first one. As you can see, self.greeting is referenced right here. That's a reference to this greeting. Okay, so we'll see that when we actually do the first response. Okay, I'm going to put this code into a REPL, and then we're going to work through the first one together so you can see what's expected on your assessment. Okay, so I have typed up all of these classes and subclasses into Replit, and I'm ready to check the output that I get for my expressions. Now, the goal of this assessment is for you to try to figure out what each expression will output before you actually do it in the code, okay? So don't just run the code and then start typing expressions, otherwise you're going to miss out on the entire purpose of the assessment, okay? Build the code, try to understand with your brain what's going to happen. In fact, I would encourage you to have a piece of paper out to sort of write notes as you go through, because for these three in particular, the ones on the right, there's a lot going on. There is a lot to think about with these expressions, okay? So don't just type them in, get the answers, and then write them into the assessment, because you still have to be able to explain it. And if you don't explain it well, you're not going to get a point for it, okay? So you got to explain it really thoroughly and successfully to get the point. And I'll send it back to you if you don't. So anyway, let's work through one of these and do this full process so you can see what I'm expecting. All right. So we've got our three classes here. We've got worker, we've got bourgeoisie, which is inheriting some data from worker, and we've got proletariat, which is inheriting some data and behavior from worker. Right. So these are subclasses from class worker, meaning they inherit some of its functionality and some of its data. So then we've got instances down here. I just want to point that out to you. So Jack, right, is an instance of the worker class, and John is an instance of the bourgeoisie class. And then notice that Jack's greeting is changed, but Jack is an instance of the worker class. So just, this is going to come up, be something to think about. All right. So let's go through the first one. I'm going to run my code, and I'm going to type in the first expression. All right, so I'm going to type in worker.work, and I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to think about what is worker.work going to be. So let's look at class worker, which is what this is, right? Just because we're not assigning it to a variable does not mean that it's not an instance, right? It's out here. We're doing the same thing as we would to create an instance of the worker class. So this right here is an instance of the worker class. It's just not being stored in a variable, so it won't be able to be used later on. And then I'm calling the work method from that worker class. So let's go see. All right, worker class, there it is, has a work method, and it returns self.greeting concatenated with iWork. Okay, so self.greeting is concatenated with iWork. Okay, so I believe I know what it is. I've got worker.work. I think that it's going to be self.greeting, which is sir, plus iWork. So I'll get sir iWork. So I'm going to go over to my assessment. I'm going to type in string sir iWork, like that. So now I need to explain it. I'll say worker is an instance of the worker class. The .work method concatenates self.greeting, which is sir, with the string iWork, and returns it. So that is an explanation of the first expression and its output. So the last thing we should do is we should go back and confirm that our output and explanation are correct. So if we run this code, if we press enter, we get sir iWork, right? That should confirm that we are correct, right? We got it right, and our explanation is, in theory, our explanation is correct, okay? Now, there could be a situation where you understand why you got the output, and maybe your explanation's a little bit off, and I'm going to send those back to you if they are really not going to earn you a point. All right, that's it for this video. If you have questions, just let me know.